I grew up in Rochester, New York, and Rochester was, well, I grew up during World War II, so that, that made a difference. My father was away during World War II. My mother was a school teacher. I went to Catholic schools. My mother insisted on, I was kind of a sickly kid, I think, originally, and she got me playing, and insisted that I play outside at night, even in the cold and all, before I could listen to any of the radio programs, favorite radio programs of those days. This is the early 1940s, and it was good for me. And when my father came home, he got me to go to the park. Well, she did too, even before he got home from the war, but go over to the park, which was across the street, the city park, and he taught me to just go over and toss a ball to myself in the air, and that sooner or later somebody would need an extra player in the game and they would invite me in, and that was really how I first got involved in athletics, which became a very important part of my life. I had encouragement as a writer, as I have mentioned, I guess, in interviews before. It was mainly my Aunt Pat who got, well, it was my mother who got me started reading and thinking in terms of words, I suppose. She was an elementary school teacher, mainly kindergarten, first grade, early elementary school. And she taught me to read before I went to kindergarten. And she was very wise. We would read 2 books together at night, one that I chose and one that she chose. And she let me have comic books, a lot of which were eventually Classics Illustrated, and gave me I was fairly culturally literate before I ever read any of the full books, I think, just from Classics Illustrated comic books, which I think were a wonderful idea. A lot of people frowned on them. I had many aunts. My mother was the youngest of a family of 14 children, and I was the only next generation of those 14. In other words, 13 of them had no children, and she had one, and that was I. And one of them, my Aunt Pat, was the one who encouraged me most in the literary way. She would have me stand up on the bed at night, and if I stayed over at their house, and look out at the stars and make up a poem of some kind. She would have recited maybe Starlight, Star Bright for me, or had me memorize it, but make up my own poem, and she would write it down and treat me like a mature writer, really. And I got used to that early in life, of thinking of myself as a writer. I always say, I think it was around the age of 3, I think Trish Charon actually looked it up in the archives of Cal State Long Beach, and says it was around 4 or something that I started writing, and so I was a year less precocious than I made myself out to be there. But that Aunt Pat, she encouraged me throughout my life. She typed my manuscripts right up to when I was already teaching, I think near the end of her life, when she was in her 80s. I would still send her short stories or things, and she would save me the time. And she was the head of the stenographic pool at Stromberg Carlson in those days, which was an early electronics company, and so she didn't mind typing for me. She would sometimes raise an eyebrow, perhaps, or say a word or something about them being a bit risque, but in general, she didn't attempt to censor them in any way at all. So I had both the encouragement of my mother and of her. And when I went to school, my mother did get me in at the age of 4.5 into kindergarten at the Catholic school. I went over and had to be interviewed and all of that, but they let me in, and I was glad, and I have been glad ever since that she did that. I got a lot of encouragement, of course, from the nuns, because I was a good student, and so I got that positive reinforcement too. The positive reinforcement as a writer and as a student that I was getting from so many quarters in those days not only had its effect on me, but I think it influenced my teaching a lot, because I really believe as a teacher, or have believed as a teacher, in positive, like the mantra of real estate agents of location, location, location. I always believed in positive reinforcement, and I still think it does work and is more important than pointing out errors, and that you have to be tactful in pointing out errors, very tactful about that. And, there was that old song, the old Bing Crosby song, too, of accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, don't mess with Mr. In-Between. I even get them singing that in creative writing classes sometimes. But anyway, I was getting that encouragement all the way through, and it builds on itself. And we had good training then in high school. It was a Jesuit high school, McQuaid Jesuit High School, and it was mainly priest teaching in those days. And we didn't get much in the way of secular literature at all, but we did study. I had counting 1 year in college, I had 5 years of Latin, and I had 4 years of ancient Greek, and we had 4 years, 2 in high school and 2 in college, of French. And then in graduate school, of course, I had to pass an exam in French and in German, and took a crash course in German. And then when in my English PhD program, I took a lot of Old English and Middle English, because that's what the people taught there, when they started it. I was the first one to get a PhD at the University of Arizona in English, and so we took what they taught. We didn't have a whole lot of choices. I was always glad that I had all that education in language, though. And when people ask me, when did you ever use it? Because you don't run into too many Romans, ancient Romans at least, to speak to, or even the fathers of the church or anything to speak to. I tell them that I use it every time I open my mouth, and I use it every time that I pick up a pen to write. They're just the whole verbal ability thing. And that whole athletic obsession, which I had in late elementary school and throughout high school, and then I started college on a football scholarship at Holy Cross, and still am fortified by athletics today, and my interest as a fan, and as still getting exercise and all as a swimmer, which I'm very bad at. But it's been such a major part of my life. I would have been really impoverished, and God knows what I would have done for self-esteem in the acne years of high school, when my acne was just about as bad as Charles Bukowski's. Really, I'm not exaggerating, but not as bad as his. His was terrible, but it was still pretty bad, enough to be somewhat inhibiting to one's social life and make one very self-conscious socially. In high school, my great friend Vince Prestiani, who was more of a reader than I was. He was an athlete too, but more of a reader than I was earlier in our development. And there was a bookstore he always wanted to go in. It was the early days of paperbacks there in the 1950s, and he would be choosing something, and I'd have my hands in my pockets at killing time and bored, and this was after basketball practice, and he'd say, "Well, just look at a book, pick one up and read one." I mean, I was so tired from sports all the time, and I read, of course, what we were assigned in class. And, we had plenty of reading and language study and all to do there. But as far as pleasure reading in the classics and the rest, he was the one who got me in that. I think the first book I finally gave in and bought in paperback and took home with me was I think the Three Musketeers, and then next the Count of Monte Cristo or something. But then pretty soon, I was reading Dubliners by Joyce, and hooked on Graham Greene, reading everything by Graham Greene. And we were supposed to be doing spiritual reading on our own for the Jesuits anyway, and when they'd ask us what we were doing, it was Graham Greene and other fallen away Catholic authors like that, or very unconventional converts like Graham Greene. And no, they said that wasn't what they had in mind. They had Chesterton and others in mind.